since we were going to do some things, I made sure the last 2 or 3 days to kind of slide back into the news cycle a little bit. I find that it was just exactly where I left it.
Hi, and welcome to the Johnny Random Show. Today's episode is on globalization, and this is really the third part in a series. The first one, we talked about fake money and monetary policy and sort of set a domestic groundwork for how to think about a lot of the issues of our current age. And then the second part would be we talked about China and our relationship on the international stage. And so today is globalization and how that intermixes with all of these different elements, and it's really its own thing. So I had to give it its own episode. All right, so the first topic that we're going to dive into today is the Golden Arches theory and how we got to our current system. So this is something Jeremy mentioned in the first episode, brought to my attention, actually something I forgot about. I learned about it a while ago, but I had not really thought about it recently. But it was basically the idea, if you had McDonald's in every country, then these countries wouldn't fight each other because they had an economic reason not to. And I think that probably shaken that theory a lot when you look at the recent events in Ukraine. And so, so I'll pitch this to Jeremy. Do you think that system, the Golden Arches, was all a lie, or was there validity to it and there were just forces that overwhelmed it and now it's not as applicable? Or what are your thoughts on that Golden Arches theory? Because you mentioned that previously, and I wanted to talk a little bit more on that.
Sure. I certainly believe it was their original plan to undermine the nation state. If you look at early globalist works, they are absolutely convinced that Germany and German nationalism caused World War I and World War II, which of course, has some validity to it. It's not like Hitler did not play on the German homeland, the unjust peace in World War I at the Treaty of Versailles, the punishment they were there. So he really built a lot of what he did on, so sort of like making Germany great again, if we can borrow the original. And so so that's where it got started. Now, somewhere along the way, I think because of economic forces, it was more or less co-opted by oligarchs, the oligarchs of Davos, the World Economic Forum. But before that, there were always large, corporations that were interested in trade across countries. When you open up a country to a new commercial market for a company and you turn it into an international company, that's where you start, trillions of dollars start flowing in. And so I do believe originally globalism began because they were trying to undermine the nation state. And so they did that through trade. And then along the way, though, the advantages that were compiled by large international corporations, be they Apple or Amazon or like that, they began to buy off internally in those nation states, those people too, at the lobbyist level, and began to write their own laws, the way incumbency always advantages them. So I do believe that was the original goal. And then it transitioned and became more economically mercenary in its basis, and began to be about money alone mainly. You can see the National Basketball Association, their desire not to criticize China, for instance, and jeopardize sneaker sales or jeopardize television and things like that. You can see that used to have a basketball organization that was American in its national, when it said national, it was talking about the American nation, that is now an international organization. And the way that money, I think that's why the Bible would teach us that money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's not the root of evil, it's just the root of all kinds of evil. And so it just multiplies when it's taken over by these mercenary interests. But now, I think what the globalists didn't take into account is that there are people that can't be bought off. There's still where you find a love of land, a love of neighbor, a love of family, where you still find, what I would call traditional valued people. And you find those in the heartland in America. You find them all across Europe. Obviously, the Five Star Party in Italy, Le Pen, just came within, you might say 20 percentage points of beating Macron, and Macron has a huge win there. But Macron was in a fight for his life against somebody that they would never have elected. I mean, she wouldn't have got 5% 10 years ago. The National Front had to be totally reworked. You've got Orban in Hungary, you've got the Law and Justice Party in Poland, you've got the Czech Republic in Eastern Europe, in Germany and in Sweden and in Norway, you also have rising parties of nationalism. So there are people that value things other than money, and the people that can't be bought off. For a while, we were okay because they didn't go after the nation state at its core. But when they start to tear down statues, when they start to move away from national documents, when they start to undermine, sort of the national culture and things like that, there's a group of people that they can't be bought off, and they're not going to be bought off. Like, I'm not going to be bought off. There's no amount of money you can offer me to betray my people, my country, my family. And so I think that there's still a significant, healthy group of people in the West, even, I mean, they're all over the East. This is the East is still this way, but the West, there's still a healthy group of people who can't be bought off. And so now that their mercenary sort of motives have been revealed, and now that you can see that they're clearly undermining their own nations, their own peoples with open border policies, doing things that no other nation would do, especially in America, I would say. You've, the Trump presidency in 2016, still you've got that, Joe Biden is probably, in the Democratic Party, is probably about to be wiped off the planet, basically in the next midterm election. And so nationalism is back, because there's still a healthy group of people that love their nations and understand that you can't judge love by virtue signaling, in the sense that you can't say, well, I love Ukraine, and therefore let's go and protect Ukraine, if you're not going to love your own people in Texas, and farmers in Texas or in Arizona or in California, or if you're going to let a city like San Francisco, a great city that built the Golden Gate Bridge. That's not a federal project. That was a city project. Cities can do wonderful things. We had these great cities, and as we watch our own cities cast into demise, it's hard to motivate people to go to other places and save those cities if we're not going to do that. So I just think the conflict in the human heart, we always have needs that need to be met. And so there is the ability to appeal to us from mercenary motives. But there's also something more than that with us. And that more is our relationship together as a people and as a nation, language, blood, history, the kind of ties that really bind. The idea that, America is a nation of ideas, but it's also a nation of shared history, people, language, and that kind of thing. And so I think globalism is the past, and it's already passing. And Russia was the first really large nation to upset the apple cart on a global scale. So
funny, it's called nationalism when you want to attack it, German Nazi nationalism, but it's patriotism when it's a good thing, so it's the same.
Right. Just as a side note too, when I was younger, say, and you guys may be old enough to remember this, but Walmart used to build an entire brand off selling things that were American made. They actually used to put flags over the things that were made. And you had, Levi's followed that as well back in the 90s. And so there was a huge push in the mid 90s, especially. So this is not, I think it's easy for us to think that this is new because of Donald Trump's presidency in 2016 and then these various works that are going on all over Europe. But the truth is, those movements are very old movements. They've been around a long time. They've just gained steam because what they prophesy have come true largely.
Sure. Hey, Matt, Golden Eight Arches theory, is it good or bad to you? We'll just go ahead and jump to the next question because I think
it's a bit idealistic would be the best answer to that. There could be good that would come out of it if it were true, just like communism. The idea that everybody shares all resources and everything is owned by all people. Like, if that could actually happen, then I think good could come out of it. But in practice, definitely can't. And that's, I would say, the real flaw with globalism. It's this idea, free trade on steroids. It is the ultimate expression of what we want to have inside of our country applied to all countries. The problem with that is that without somebody that is sufficiently able to oversee justice internationally, it becomes the Wild West. So instead of the promised land that the global market is supposed to be, we ended up in the Wild West, where the strongest companies, shoot their competition and win. So it's just it's a nightmare is what I would say. But I don't think that it was ill-intentioned, and I think that if it were possible to work, that it would be good.
Yeah, so not
Kind
good,
of.
bad, but a nightmare. So I'm gonna give a slightly contrarian view. Because I'm
Well,
watching some documentaries, and they're talking about how globalism basically allowing third world countries to their markets to enjoy and get into the game, and lifting I think less than or half the world was working on less than $1 a day. And over the last several 10 years, or that first decade of the 2010s, that changed. And they credit that largely to globalization and free trade and NAFTA and all these different systems that were in place, these world systems. And I think that when it works okay when you have a world policeman and a global hegemon. And so I don't think I think it was conceptualized earlier than, in what is that treaty after World War II where it's escaping me right now, but
Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods, yeah, sort of conceptualized in that, but it didn't really take fruition until after the bipolarization of the world turned into a unipolar world where the U.S. was a global hegemon, and now the U.S. dollar was king, and now it could truly. Yeah. It's like now truly the globalization dreams can be fulfilled because
Pax Americana.
You cannot really make a system like that work without a system of rules. And I think it worked too well. And so it's like libertarian ideology without constraints. It has, to me, some negative side effects in that, it's very a dog eat dog world, and where the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, if you can't do it, if you can't get ahead, it's free and open and, playing field. So anybody ought to be able to do it. If I can do it, anybody can do it type mentality. And what we've had recently, and I think to me, why you're seeing such a harsh backlash with Brexit, Macron almost getting defeated recently, Trump, a couple of years ago, all of these things are saying that, like, hey, a lot of people got left behind in these countries that were advanced. And so, yeah, you may have brought the third world, into a second world or a 1.5 world now. It's not even in the second world yet, but it's coming up. In some places, it was a little bit more successful than others. Some places were very successful, right? BRICS, those BRIC countries, they're very successful. The rest of them, kind of getting a little bit of in on the success. But what it did is it created, I think, a lot of bitterness in the first world. So I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the reaction, because it's almost like our global elites care more about the other rest of the world than this world that they live in. And it is an attack on nation states. And so I don't think we've had a very productive conversation on that up until this date, in my opinion. And that's why started the impetus for having this conversation. So anybody want to respond to that? I don't think I'm disagreeing. I think I'm just maybe trying to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Yeah, I always look at it. So we talk about free trade, but really what free trade was, and that and GAFTA and all that was extremely targeted trade, and it targeted specific aspects within the U.S. to literally destroy. So, as an example, we imported Chinese steel no tariff, but they had high tariffs on American steel in China. We couldn't ship there. During the Trump presidency, we found out that we had 180% tariff on American dairy going into Canada, but Canada was paying zero to ship dairy into the US. So there was a lot of targeted trade, and what it was targeted for was actually to build up what they thought of as the middle class in other countries. And so, and they would say, well, when they destroyed, say, the steel sector, they would say learn to code, we just learn to code. And so their answers to things were kind of be well-intentioned. You could see now after World War II is the first place they do it, right? We reset the German mark. So the German mark, they're wallpapering walls with a thing. They get rid of it. They set a new mark. They make it where you can't print it. They give Germany a really strong currency, and then they turned Bavarian Motor Works, BMW, right into a car company from an airplane company for build airplanes anymore. But then they make it so that they actually have advantages in America and other places to sell their goods. And German engineering, have always been known as great engineers. And so we actually did a lot against our own interest to rebuild Germany and to rebuild Europe after World War II. And then we took that show on the road. We took it to Africa, and we took it to Asia. And a lot of that too was not really done. Like there's been a lot of money spent there. And as much as we've lifted people from poverty, a lot of those places are not really all that better off, because they didn't learn to be self-sufficient. They didn't learn their I saw this. I've been involved in some missions organizations that build businesses and things like that, and help people build businesses and loans and banking, and say in Uganda and places. And so we saw this where a lot of what we did actually damaged the third world or the developing world. We damaged their ability to be self-sufficient, and we made them dependent. And, China learned this as well, and have gone back now and used the same sort of techniques that we used originally to try to help those countries. But they came back through and did what they wanted to do, which is what we had actually done and what it ended up happening.
On accident.
Yeah, what we did on accident, but they saw how well it worked. They did it on purpose, and they built the Silk Road and belt. And they've indebted countries to them. They've taken over their infrastructures and things like that. So, globalism in and of itself, I think, starts out with this "let's help the poor" concept. And I think that, just like all of us, we have a hard time seeing the trade-offs of what will happen when, say, you destroy all the steel towns in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Now they're opioid dens, and they've been run into the ground, and their local businesses and cultures have been destroyed, and their towns were emptied out because they had to go somewhere else to find jobs and things like that. So yeah, I think globalism has been in some degree a success. Obviously, because it was a very efficient system that provided very cheap goods, but people did not realize that what they were doing, just paying higher taxes, the money was going to whatever central power it was going to, being washed around and then sent out to, like, if it's being sent out to farmers, being sent out to producers, being sent out to people. So that we really didn't get cheap goods. We just got higher taxes that went, and then we paid we brought the price of the good down by just sloshing money out of Washington into the pockets of agribusiness and that kind of thing. And that's what really lowered prices. It wasn't so much competition like it should have been. It was more, central command and control is what it ended up being. So
seems like there was no end game, and I don't think it even worked, like I said, until the unipolar system came about after the, fall of the Soviet Union. And then now I think that it's going to fall apart. I think it's already past its, like you said, or I think Russia is the first, we're going back to a bipolar world. That was the whole Russia episode, or China episode, was talking about how Russia is basically, China is letting Russia overextend itself. It becomes the, currency, what's it called?
The world's lender.
No, the
reserve currency.
Reserve currency, yeah. And it's got the Silk Belt and Road Initiative. It's got its fingers in, all across the globe. And so it's creating its own little axis over there. And, it's going to let larger powers that, would try to rival its bipolar, force fall, and so it can become that secondary force. And its intention is to overcome that. Now, I don't think they can do it. I really don't. The more I've been looking into China, the more I think that you can't authoritarian government your way into success. And people like to say, that they're more capitalist than we are. I don't see that, as far as like when you create an environment for this capitalist system to, work, it's not capitalism. It is authoritarianism, and it's not going to, I don't think it's going to pan out for them. And I don't think they're nearly as strong as they think they are. And when you're at the whims of one person, when you lock down your economy over and over and over through a global pandemic, you are really kneecapping yourself. And
it's like engineered love.
Yeah.
Basically.
It's not going to work as good as you think it is. I don't.
China has a ton of problems in and of itself. I mean, they had a one-child policy for 60 years. Their demographics are absolutely disastrous. No one talks about their demographic winter. I mean, they are staring a demographic winter in the face. And then they started saying, no, you can have more children, but they can't. They create a one-child policy for 60 years, create a one-child culture. And so now people are, that's sort of ingrained. You can't just make a law and expect for people to go, okay, now I can have 3 kids. But they had been one, they'd already been trained to be one. They had agreed to the oneness. And so now they've got a real aging population, and they've got a ton of debt, and they've got a free floating currency as well that they just change the pegs on whenever it suits them to devalue it. To create advantages for themselves in the market. I mean, that kind of stuff works in short terms, but they have cities that are built that are like our bridges to nowhere from the 1930s. I mean, they have entire cities no one lives in. They're just concrete jungles. They just poured them out. So, I mean, a lot of their growth has come at the expense of actual economics. So I always say what comes up must come down. What goes up on an escalator comes down on an elevator. And I would expect China's just as afraid that the United States will fail as the United States is afraid that it will fail. I mean, China is still very, very dependent on the U.S. Do they have a middle class? Yes. Do they have enough in their middle class, enough purchasing power in their middle class to support their production? They do not.
I also, as much as I used to think of them as like, they're my, the next thing. But I think that they've already overextended themselves, but I don't think it's too late. I think in a deglobalized world, you don't know what's next, so to speak. I think that when we're headed for, looks like either Cold War II or World War III. And I don't know which it is yet. I think it's too early to tell. I don't think anybody can tell. We do not have sound leadership right now in the White House. And I don't think that bodes well for this situation in Ukraine and Russia. I think that is a very precarious situation, and we could be a couple years away from active conflict, which truly and deeply bothers me, but also I think too, a Cold War with China could just as easily take place. And I think that there's a case to be made that they will shore up their, sometimes you're better, iron sharpens iron, right? So if you have a strong competition, makes you compete back. And I think that's where China could fall into. If chips do fall in their favor over the next several years, and who knows how much longer. I mean, Xi Jinping is 60 something years. So, I mean, he probably has a good decade of leadership or more left. But after him, who knows what could happen, and you're talking about a country with over 1.4 billion people. That's a lot of possibilities. And it has a long tradition of existence to pull from. So I don't underestimate them, but I think that we shouldn't overestimate them either. But what it means for America, deglobalization is going to hurt. I think that's the bottom line bottom line conclusion that I've come to. This is going to hurt. So let me talk about NATO for a second. First of all, should we have gotten rid of NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union? Was there a case, in you guys' opinion, I'm gonna go back to Matt, for keeping NATO around and adding countries to NATO? And then after we talk about that hypothetical, should it have existed or not existed? What is its role today? Should it be expanded? Should we just keep it where it is? How can we de-escalate with Russia, if that's possible? Matt.
Well, oh goodness, what order to take all that in? So, should it exist? I think
after the fall of the Soviet Union.
After the fall of the Soviet Union, it would be foolish to lay down arms, like completely, obviously. And the treaties that we made were things that have to continue. They were commitments that were made. So I would say it can't not. We had no idea when this threat was going to subside, nor really if the threat had subsided, because a country that was very desperately destabilized still had nuclear weapons, a lot of them. So even though we say the Cold War ended, they wanted to say that it ended because a victor was there. People in the Pentagon, people in the know, knew that it could be set off again. There's all it would take is how Germany after World War I had a bit of a period of quiet, and then a leader came in who was going to fix the problems. Well, that's exactly what happened with Putin. A leader came in and he fixed the problems left over from this defeat in a war, because they lost in the Cold War. So he's like, the last administration just didn't do it right. Well, I'm going to fix things. So I mean, I think NATO relaxing would probably have been a mistake. They didn't repeat the same mistake of World War I to II, where they penalized the country that had instigated it. So I mean, I don't know. I think we did roughly right. Whether or not it should have been expanded is another question. It's good to make friends. It's good to have allies. Whether or not you need to continue to expand and to make it, I don't know. That's a tough call. I think that it's justifiable. Whether it's justified in hindsight.
What's different than after World War I with Germany is we introduced the Russia to the global system. Like that's how the oligarchs were created. We tried to establish and give them here's how you join the rest of the world. We're going to give you the golden arches. This is your introduction in there. We didn't want to repeat that. I feel like possibly Russia, I mean, we talked out of both sides of our mouth. Okay. Like, so here's here's how you join the rest of the democracies. Right. And here's also, we're going to keep expanding NATO, which is a military force, a military alliance against you. So we're going to let you into the club, but we're also going to build up potentially. I feel like it sends mixed messages at least. And I think that, so maybe we did half right, but I think that, I don't know. I mean, that's just my thoughts on what you're saying.
NATO is a strategic alliance that is actually essentially trying to do what the nuclear weapons have done, but without necessarily going to nuclear threat. So NATO has Article 5, right, where any nation that is attacked by anybody. So let's say Iran decides to attack Poland. Wait, is Poland part of
Turkey.
NATO?
Yeah, I think Poland is.
Yeah, Turkey and Poland, either one. So if any of those happen, that would trigger Article 5 under my understanding of it.
Yes.
So it's a strategic alliance that is not limited to Russia. It's basically an acknowledgement that these people have a common interest in defending each other and a common enough form of government that they feel comfortable committing to do so.
Yeah, I don't know. Jeremy, do you what are your thoughts on that? Should it have been abolished after the Soviet Union fell or expanded?
I'm a so I'll I'm a pretty staunch like localist and nationalist. So the NATO alliance, I believe, had its most fruitful period during World War II, and when the World War II was ended, I would have preferred NATO be disbanded. I'm sort of a goodwill toward all alliances with none. I stay away from I try to stay away from global organizations altogether, just because they're the distance from the rule between the ruled and those who are ruling becomes so disparate between, so if NATO for instance, that Article 5 reminds me a lot of how World War I even started. You had an assassination, the Croats and the Serbs, and then they declared war on each other, and then both had allies. And because they had declared war on each other, then you had their allies jumped in until the whole world was involved. And so I look at like the Ukraine situation and see that Ukraine is in a fight for its life against Russia, probably because we tried to push NATO, at least at some level. And I don't think all this is true. I mean, some of this is a little dicey because, Russia has its own history and idea of itself as a spiritual kingdom too. There's Mother Russia, and so there's a lot that go into that. But they do have a history of being invaded twice, from the West, obviously. And so they do have a legitimate complaint about bringing missiles right up to their border. And so if they were going to place, if Russia or China was trying to place missiles somewhere near my border in Mexico, we'd be pretty upset about it. So I think that in that case, so I'm not a big NATO guy. I think that all those countries over there should have their own armies and should defend themselves, and we shouldn't be paying for their defense. And a lot of what has caused our economic woes has been us trying to fulfill our NATO obligations of defending these nations and putting bases in their nations and building the economics of those nations. Several times we try to relocate bases out of Germany or in Germany even, and that we wouldn't do it because the towns had built their economies around these U.S. Army bases, and if the bases came out of those areas, you're going to hurt the German economy. So we ended up sort of being a little trapped, and then the Germans and the French and the British didn't pay their fair share. One of the big things that Donald Trump brought to the forefront was how they were supposed to be setting aside a certain part of their GDP for defense to pay us back for all they've done, and they hadn't done it. And so here we've done targeted trade, here we'd ripped our middle class out, here we are committed to their defense, and then they do not reciprocate, they do not hold up their end of the bargain, and it puts us in a position like this, like Ukraine. I do not want to see women and children killed, and I do not want to see a defenseless nation destroyed by another nation. But I also look at that region and I apply what I call, or what has been called, subsidiarity, right? So there is, I'm nearer to you, John Mark, than I am to someone in Peru. And if there's a problem in Peru, then you have a Peruvian neighbor helps to solve that. I don't hop on a plane and solve it. So that in those parts of the world, and I feel this way about the Middle East too, the nations of the places in this world, they understand the history and the culture better than we do. They understand the intricacies of the organizations. They know who speaks Russian in Ukraine and who doesn't. They know more about the Donbass, and they know more about Ossetia, and they know more about all these regions than we do. And so while we can have experts that study it from afar, it's still not our culture, language. It doesn't proceed from something we really were a part of. And so I would rather see localized organizations. And what I mean by localized, I mean like Eastern Europe, Eurasia, the region handle that problem and negotiate through that rather than us. And so, but if we push NATO as far as Eurasia, then we invite. I mean, Article 5 can be. I mean, I'm not going to war for Turkey. I have no interest in fighting Turkey's wars. Erdogan is a complete jerk. I mean, who does some crazy stuff. We need to get out of bed with these tin pot dictators and do as George Washington instructed us, which is to have goodwill toward all and alliances with none, if we can keep it. And I'm not against treaties. The Constitution makes a way for that and all those kind of things. I just want to be careful in when we make those treaties, and those treaties need to have a start and stop date. They need to have a beginning and an end. We don't need these perpetual kind of treaties. I mean, it's like Taiwan. What are we going to do when China comes for Taiwan? How many American boys are we going to send to Taiwan? And people are going to say, hey, we've committed to defending Taiwan through a treaty 50 or 60 years ago. There's no argument really against that. So we have to, are we going to send American boys to die in Taiwan if China invades? If we don't, we violated a treaty and we broke our word. If we do, I'm still not sure we're going to be doing the right thing. So they just keep us, these perpetual treaties keep us caught in organizations that the world changes around them, and their reason for being, I think, ceased, at the end of World War II, where it started.
Yeah.
I don't disagree. I would nuance that I don't think that the way NATO has ever been implemented was wise. But do I think that it has value, and that if it were a little more laid back in a way? Article 5 is just way aggressive. If we're a little more laid back, at least post Cold War, then that would make a lot more sense, because we really shouldn't have these bases that are there forever and these treaties that are there forever. I agree.
I agree. Rational leaders before too. I mean, we had people. I mean, we had the president of the United States called Vladimir Putin a thug and a murderer. I don't disagree with the statement. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's wrong to even have said it. I'm just saying that is not diplomacy. And the whole keep your friends close and your enemies closer. I mean, we're brandishing, we're rattling sabers and using the language of war, but then we don't expect the reciprocation of it. And it's just we are acting in an extremely arrogant way right now. That's so arrogant. You would never talk to anybody that was your enemy that way, especially if you thought it might come to blows and it might end up killing your whole family. You'd be trying to avoid that conflict as much as you possibly can. But the wisdom of our leadership has just, on both sides of the aisle. I mean, Joe Biden is an extreme example of incompetency. I mean, it's incompetent, but the Republican side, I would say, is not much more competent, than the Democratic side, just slightly more competent.
I just feel like they're trying to exist within the space that has been created at that we've all inherited, rather than trying to debate the great issues of our time. And this is something that kind of constantly frustrates me. We're constantly debating New Deal, Great Depression era politics when we're in a globalized world. We have a different set of issues. We have immigration, we have technology, big tech. What do we do in this space? And we have globalization. We're closer to our neighbors than ever. And I think that I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Jeremy. I just think that there's a part of me that says we do have some interest in what goes on in the world, because we have, for good or for ill, we have microchips and a lot of goods. All our supply chains are in all these other countries. And we have had horrible trade deals, and the time to get out of them was the last decade, and build here was the last decade. Now we're behind the curve so far that can we let all of this just fall, because it's going to have such a huge economic impact. And I think that there might be a case for, just washing our hands, just letting it go. But that is going to require a significant portion of the population to buy in. And I don't see anybody on the right making a coherent argument. I think that the immigration debate, if you want to call it debate, was was necessary. I think the Twitter story was important because it emphasizes how, free speech, it's our ability to communicate with each other being hindered by, gatekeepers. It's a part of a larger story, and I think we're in a bigger story right now that centers around, like I said, immigration, trade with the world, and this globalization, we'll call it that, and also, like I said, what was I just said the three things, but but I think those are the great debates of our time, and we're not having them. Nobody's really having them, or we're having them in a very subtle way, and we're just tiptoeing towards what I see as a disaster. And like you said, I don't want to send anybody to war in Taiwan to fight basically about our ability to have microchips, and cheap goods in America. That does not sound like a good idea to me, but also I don't want our economy to collapse because we're cut off from wheat, oil, gas, all of our goods, our ability to make, everything that we have. There's some piece of it in almost every country. And if those countries do enough of them ally against us, it's just going to put us in a world of hurt. And so, yeah, do I think that it's in our economic best interest, is it our ability to survive as a nation to fight? Yes, but that's a harder, but what I don't want it to get there, I guess is what I'm saying. So, I think Biden is a very, very weak leader. That is the best way I can describe him.
We're in this business right now because of Afghanistan. I mean, I'm convinced because of the Afghanistan withdrawal, that's where Putin sharpened his knives and said, okay, these guys are weak. They're not going to do anything. We better strike now. The reason I throw Taiwan out there is because I think that because of Afghanistan, you're liable to see a move into Taiwan, or at least a stronger arm used by control them, because I think they think we won't do anything, or that we are incapable of doing anything, or incapable of making a decision fast enough to stop them. And I think they probably have a limited though. I think they're looking at the next election thinking, man, this is the chance of a lifetime. We haven't had anybody this lost and incompetent, I don't know, since maybe Ulysses S. Grant. This Biden has got to be the worst president next to Ulysses S. Grant, and that guy was drunk all the time. So I've never seen a man not drunk be this ridiculous. I didn't mean to cut you.
No, I guess I'm a little conflicted on that, because I see Biden as, I want to get out of Afghanistan? Absolutely. Do I think that the military industrial complex, for lack of a better term, did not want to get out of Afghanistan and kept us there for, Trump was supposed to get us out, but Trump didn't get us out. Obama was supposed to get us out. He didn't get us out. Everybody has not been able to get us out effectively, and Biden did. So do I credit him that? Yes, great. And how could he have known that it would be such a disaster? I think the fact that it was a disaster, it speaks more to the incompetency of the deep state, if you will. And I think that, to me, that's a bigger problem. When our professional military class can't pull off basic operations in a third world country, that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And I think that's the message that sends. Now, again, I just like to nuance that, because I feel like Trump didn't do it, but Trump should have done it. Everyone should have done it. So I'm going to try to give Biden the credit that he's due for actually doing it. Was his timing absolutely awful?
Terrible.
I think so. Yeah. And I think that his perception in the world took a huge hit there. So I agree with you that I think that that's why Putin is doing it now. I think the demographics in Russia are just getting worse and worse. I think there's a lot of factors why Putin chose to do it now. And that was one piece. I think that was a major piece. So I would absolutely agree with you. I want to give a little credit to Biden, where, I think he's been in politics long enough the one thing that I give them credit for, to just sort of see through the bureaucratic BS and be like, okay, generals, you're just going to do it, and just push them to actually do it. I hate that they were incompetent to do it. I have a buddy of mine who's in the military, and I was talking to him about if the U.S. went to war, we would look basically like Russia in Ukraine. Because for the first month or two, we absolutely would. How many people fail their PRTs, their physical fitness test? It's like 10% of the military right now is just completely out of shape. If we were to get in or be attacked, it would be a disaster trying to mobilize it. We're just not set up. We've been in peacetime, even though we've been in war for so long. And I realize my face is frozen. That's very awkward. But
well, also, we do have an amazing elite force, but our general forces perhaps are terrible. Our elite forces are still the best in the world.
That you can't exactly tell a military what it's going to be in an actual conflict. Right now, Russia considers itself in a special operations mode. Yeah, they goofed it up big time, but an all-out war with Russia would not be simple. I think the Germans made that mistake in World War II, right? Battle of the Bulge. They assumed that, hey, where do we get the phrase, don't attack Russia in the winter?
Wrong name, but yes.
Yeah, sorry.
It wasn't the Bulge.
World War II history. I just throw it all. Yeah. It's like a big, it's too much things there going on.
Never go into a land war in Asia.
In Asia.
the old line.
Yeah. So, let's see. Let's get around to this last question.
Can I add one more to this little point? And the only thing I want to add is that another reason why I would like to get out of a lot of these organizations is because I think the speed in which the U.S. needs to pivot, it needs to shed a lot of dead weight to do it. Like, we don't need to ask France what the U.S. needs to do. We don't need to ask Great Britain what the U.S. needs to do, or Germany what the U.S. needs to do. That, great ship is turned by a little rudder. But I always point out that, the Titanic didn't see the iceberg. No, they saw the iceberg. They just didn't see it in time. And they had a great big old ship, and they had to turn it, and there wasn't enough time to turn it. So I just think there's a lot of things that are going to need to be quickly pivoted, and exiting these large organizations that we're a part of is probably going to be necessary in order to make those pivots. Like to pivot back home. You're going to have to pivot back to probably some type of defense of the homeland. And our U.S. forces probably actually need to be reduced in size instead of increased, because we actually have a lot that we're defending all over the world, a ton of money, and redeploy them into different areas. And so I would just, one of my points about ending NATO, like now, I mean, of course, I would say no, I don't want to do it at all, but ending those things now is that I think the time for quick pivots is going to come. And that a lot of these organizations are big, wieldy organizations and require Security Council votes and everybody being on board and unanimity. And I think that we're just going to have to make much faster decisions than those organizations are going to be able to make economically, defensively. I even think a lot of those lines are going to be redrawn economically. We talked a little bit about Russia, but Europe said they weren't going to buy coal in rubles. They were just going to not do it. And then it got cold, and 3 countries are already buying in rubles. Russia sent their first shipment of coal to China today, and in yuan trade. So you're already seeing a lot of, every dollar that's not converted into a US dollar and bought and used on the open market and the global market that's not being converted, that dollar's coming back here. That dollar's on. So there may be great inflation ahead of us, but it's going to be a lot of little inflation leading up to then, and being able to pivot quickly, I think, is important. So that's just one of my knocks against large global organizations too. Distance from the rule to the ruler, and then also the slowness at which they function.
So the whole thing about buying in rubles is basically a sanction on Russia, or by Russia on the U.S. by slowly inflating U.S. currency by sending it all back.
That's exactly right. And you're seeing it with China too. China's already sanctioning you in having Russia buy in yuan. And each one of those countries doing that. Iran, I think, already set up a military agreement just the other day with China too. And each one of these little moves moves us closer to a dual reserve currency or a multiple reserve currency. I think last time we were on, we even mentioned Saudi Arabia was kind of in negotiations already with China to sell oil in yuan too. I mean, that's a death knell for the petrodollar, if those kind of things happen. So, anyway, there's a lot going on in the world. So we'll get back to globalization. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fun. I just sometimes I run to the end of the thought and want to move on, but I like camping, and talking about this stuff. And I thought of it.
I believe that.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I believe that chances are the reason that we have these long-term commitments, the treaties and things like that, is as part of the agreements to make the U.S. dollar a stable thing in the rest of the world. We have to have a military presence in order to guarantee the safety of these countries so that they continue to be reliant upon U.S. currency. I think that is probably the deal that happened, and that's why we're in this situation. So.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing that I kind of think about is like we have these special relationships because we have troops all around the world, because we give away our middle class, because we make it good for them, and think of an analogy of like a really bossy sister, that has all her siblings kind of like, you sit over here and play, and I'm going to, keep the bullies in the neighborhood away from you and whatever. And it just seems like it's a very controlling situation. And then when a bully comes up, another little girl, like, oh, we can't, Russia, we don't play with her, we don't like her. It just seems sort of petty the way we draw our alliances. And I think that people are looking around, and if it wasn't for the fact that we're the global bully, that people might get up and walk out of the house, and we don't like that. The globalists don't like that. We don't, we like everybody sitting there playing the game we wanted to play. It's our toys, it's our game. You're going to play with our toys. You can't play with that toy like that. It reminds me of that type of situation. And sorry, this analogy just came to me on the fly, so it's probably horrible. But back to Saudi Arabia, when you mentioned that, I thought that was, what wasn't it just last week? I want to say it was last week where they came into the meeting with our ambassador in shorts and started yelling at him, and basically, said, throwing a temper tantrum, and because we're trying to reduce the price of oil, right? Gas prices, inflation, obviously Biden wants to bring down the price because I think that's hurting, obviously, his approval rating. So, but they're laughing him out of, town. And to me, like, you can look at it and be like, oh, Biden's so weak. But then I also look at it like America and American power means nothing to these people. We're so disrespected by the Saudi Arabian. Why do we consider them this ally? They do it just overtly under Trump. They do it overtly now under Biden, but they always have this resentment towards us. Why do we tolerate that? It's frustrating from my patriotism comes out, I get irritated with that. But that's
I know a little bit about Saudi Arabia. I mean, we've been trying because they have leadership that wants to be more Western, is very friendly towards Western ideas. They've been trying to get their leaders educated in Western understanding, and that has given a lot of people hope that a country in Saudi Arabia, in a very, very critical part of the world, will become like us. It will become, westernized. in true fashion, similar to the way that Japan did. So we're hoping to make another Japan out of Saudi Arabia, and that hope has kept us in the game, essentially, in Saudi Arabia.
But I think that they've just proven that over and over and over that that's silly, that they're not serious. They're going to kill news reporters, journalists. They're going to behead people that disagree with them and publicly, and we just turn a blind eye to it. I mean, like they are a despicable place, and we put up with it. Most of the hijackers from 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia, and then we attack Saddam Hussein or whatever. Like what or I always get him mixed up with
Osama bin Laden.
Osama bin Laden. Yeah, I always say the wrong one in the wrong moment, and I need to.
Yeah, you got it right though. Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, but
I always the Saudi regime is very interesting. The crown is supposed to pass brother to brother. A father to son crowns pass in the West. In the East, it passes brother to brother. So when the king died, or was he was too old to rule, his son is the one who took power instead of his father's brother, and they turned the Riyadh Marriott into a torture chamber. That guy hung his uncles up by their ankles and tortured them until they gave up their computer codes so they could. That people didn't keep up with it because the Western news media doesn't have any interest in showing Saudi Arabia in a negative light sometime. And so it was a very period over there when the king's son took over all that just recently. And he's sort of cast as a reformer, but because we didn't do a lot of work about his background, he did break some traditions and stuff there. It's a very interesting scenario over there anyway. One of the things I've always complained about, and this is just like I've always this was so in 2003 when we went into Iraq, I was the only conservative I knew against it. Every conservative I knew, I worked with guys, man, they would come down hard on me. And the reason I was against it was that, look, I would say things like, look, there's a reason why they're not a republic. There's a reason why they still look the way they do and dress the way they do and act the way they do and think the way they do. Like we have, if you think about when you go and you read the Federalist Papers, they quote the Bible, but they also quote the Greeks, the Greco-Roman, reform. When they set up our Senate, they actually talked about why the Senate failed in Rome and how they were going to fix that failure by creating a new check. I mean, they were interacting with 3,500 years of material. So I would say like America's democracy, our republic was forged in like 3,500, 4,000 years worth of fire. And I complained that we were treating that cavalierly, like it was instant pudding. We were just going to go over there and pour some milk in a bowl and stir in some pudding, and boom, you were going to have democracy. So I've always made the case, and this y'all may feel differently about this, but I personally don't feel like Islam has the moral foundation to support a republic in that way. Like even the ideas of republics were legitimately borrowed from the Old Testament. There was a king, but there was also a Sanhedrin of 70. There's representative leadership. Each of the tribes have representative leaders. I mean, you can go back through that. There's a book called Lex Rex by Samuel Rutherford, where he goes through how all the original governments and things like that, the way we were establishing our governments after the Reformation, they based a lot on the Old Testament there. And so my point has always been that they lacked the history. They lacked the functional kind of ideas that needed to be in place so that you could have a democracy. And my point has always been that if you gave them the ability to vote, they would eventually just vote a tyrant into place. They would choose that because that's what they've chosen before. Everybody would say, well, no, they didn't choose a dictator or they didn't choose a king. But the truth is everybody's ruled by consent. If we didn't consent, if 350 million people in this country didn't consent to Joe Biden ruling us, he wouldn't, and that's always been the way it is. So that's the way I've always thought about why I thought a lot of these ideas that we have about spreading democracy with the sword. You hear George W. Bush say the world yearned for freedom. And I was always like, I don't know what world he's looking at. I don't see a world yearning for freedom. I see a world yearning for, power, prestige, for, and they come by it any way they can. And most of the time, that's might makes right. We were the first people to ever transition power peacefully. When George Washington declined the crown here, when it was offered to him, he said, "No, you don't need a king." He declined the crown. And when we passed from one president to another, I mean, it was a momentous period in history. Nobody's ever done it before. We were the first. To think that Saudi Arabia or Iran are going to do those things, because we knock them over with arms, I think it's just naive. I just don't think they're the particular religious persuasion of that part of the world is just the polar opposite of what we think. It's flipped around. And so I just don't think I just think Christianity produces the foundation for liberty, and Islam or Buddhism or whatever ism you want to pour back into that slot generally just produces something other than liberty. So.
No, I tend to agree completely. And I've been looking a lot into the Reformation for another video I'll be doing on kind of like tracing our ideologies back, liberal and conservative, libertarian and socialism even. And that's one thing that is really come up a lot is without the first Great Awakening in the colonies, that set a place for the population to accept a lot of the ideas that the founding fathers were laying out. And the founding fathers drew from a lot of different places, like you were saying. And then once we had the two-party system, after George Washington said, we don't need a two-party system, or we don't need parties, we fell into that immediately, and found out that, healthy democracies debate big ideas, the issues of the day, and created a party system anyway. And so we have had these debates, and that's where, kind of I was alluding to earlier, I feel like we're not debating the issues of the days. Both parties, neither parties, I should say, are not debating what you're talking about. Like you're saying, you're the only person that was saying this because you were looking at, how do these other countries work and what is our role in that? That should be something that we were talking about, because like I said, the world got smaller when we got the internet, when we got the ability to like mass transit across the world, airplanes flying around the world. This suddenly became an issue, and we don't have a framework right now for looking at these things. And I think it's important. I think it's really important to talk through some of these issues and debate them from a place of, is it possible to even spread democracy around the world? I think that we just went into it with the idea of, yeah, we can spread, this globalist ideology comes from a place where we have the tools. It's very Thomas Paine, we have the tools for democracy, to make this, humanity has found this, this enlightened ideas, and we can just use that and change the world. And sort of the conservative movement was kind of like, okay, well, let's reform along the way, and that's why, Burke was against the French Revolution. He didn't say anything about the American Revolution, but he was against the French Revolution because he saw that it would turn into a dictatorship. Eventually it did pan out and worked well for them, but it wasn't necessarily a smooth transition, the French Revolution.
Massive understatement.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, terrible. Led to Napoleon and the essentially the end of the Holy Roman Empire. It altered all of Europe. I always point to that 1800s, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right at the end of the 1700s. I mean, they're revolutionary not just in warfare; they're revolutionary in every way. I mean, in France, they basically were year one changing their day names. Our revolution was certainly military, and it was certainly ideas that came from both revolutions was the idea that you could establish a foundation of a government between a government and its people. rather than between a government and its people and God, which was the real revolutionary thing about both of those foundings. So
yeah. So like I said, the Great Awakening and that gave us a base for being able to set up the way we did. So yeah, I think that I totally agree, absolutely 100% with what you were saying. You know, I don't think that the Muslim world necessarily has the tools in their belt to even go through these ideas. They don't have that framework that we had, you know, or I'm blessed to have.
I used to just ask, like, people would say, you know, we're going to spread democracy there. And I would say, well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Are you saying voting? Because if your definition of democracy is voting, your definition of democracy is woefully incomplete. I mean, it's woefully incomplete. You know, I mean, anybody can build a voting booth. And I mean, voting has been going around for a long time, but democratic societies, republics, you know, especially people who are ruled under law, I mean, these were revolutionary ideas that the king and the lowest man in his kingdom would all answer one law, that the law would reign and not man, essentially. I mean, these are huge. And that again, that derives from Christianity. You know,
Right.
that derives right out of the law of Moses. And it's, people don't take into account how absolutely revolutionary that idea would have been in the ancient world, much less all the way up into the modern era, that people would be equal under the law and that the law would apply to them. That concept is not, when you hear MSNBC talk about it, they never mention anything about what it really means to be a democracy, or what type of democracy are we going to be. You know, Jefferson said democracies were as bloody coming in as they were going out. And that democracy, our founding fathers didn't believe democracies were things to be chosen. You know, they were that the rule of the mob, that 51% of the people under a democracy could deny 49% of the people their rights. Those are concepts. But if you try and say anything against the idol of democracy in the modern era, prepare to be lynched. I mean, in every which way you can be lynched for saying that. But the truth of the matter is that we're really not a democracy. We are a republic, and a republic is vastly different than a democracy. And do we really want to spread raw democracy around the world? The left certainly does. You know, they believe Hillary Clinton should win the election because she got more votes, not because more cities, states, and regions voted for her, which they didn't. You know, you could look at the map; it's written down. But if you look at a couple of major cities, she wins LA, she wins New York. If we're raw vote counting, and that's the left's always trying to get rid of the electoral college too. You know, again, they want democracy, and I think we should define those terms a lot better than we do.
Well, I would say the left and the right. You know, it's kind of ironic to me that and we might disagree on this, but that the left went around how Donald Trump stole the election and Russian interference and, you know, swaying all these votes and whatnot, you know, and election interference, and it wasn't legitimate, and went so far as to impeach him. And then now Donald Trump is walking around like, oh, it was an illegitimate, you know, election, and I should have been, okay. So we're undermining, you know, this whole process.
He's attacking democracy.
He's undermining the legitimacy of, you know, so we're going to call it a rigged election when we lose, just like they called it a rigged election when they lost. And that didn't go so well for them. You know, if it weren't for the pandemic, then, you know, he would still be president. I feel, I don't think it had anything to do with, you know, rigged election. You know, I think that's not, didn't bear out. So we're getting off of, we're getting off. So the last question here is what happens next, right? Trade deals, NAFTA, the World Health Organization, World Trade Organization, and the IMF, International Monetary, what's that stand for? International Monetary Fund. Yeah.
Fund.
Yeah, didn't write down what my acronyms meant and blanking out. So, yeah. So, I guess I'll say what I think will happen next. You know, and I kind of already alluded to this. You know, we're headed for World War III or Cold War II. I just think that there's one of those two is absolutely unavoidable. I think we're at a political malaise where our party systems are not talking about the actual issues of the day, which would be globalism, immigration, and it's not addressing the concerns, and therefore we're not going to be able to. Somebody's going to come along. Some person is going to come along, and I thought it would have been Trump, because he definitely attacked the globalization and immigration. He was actually addressing the issues of the day and did not change the Overton window enough, apparently, for the conversation. And I think that somebody on his side of the spectrum will win the next election. There has to be somebody's got. Oh, and tech. That was the third one. I was saying three, and nobody's talking about tech currently, and even Trump. I mean, I guess he did attack the media and how it was fake news and all that kind of stuff. And I think that in a certain form was, what I'm
Trump
talking
would say,
about.
"What? I built Truth Social, man."
Right? Yeah. And so, we're going into the next phase of what like I said, the issues are, and the right has no clear vision, in my opinion. I don't think Trump had a clear message per se to address these things coherently. I don't think he certainly won the argument, because I think he abandoned his own. I think he campaigned on the right issues, but I think he left them when he got in office, and he didn't see them through. He didn't campaign on them in his second term. So I don't know what happened there. I think it was an instinctive, he campaigned on his instinct of what the issues were, and I think he was correct. But do I think he did very good? In my opinion, not necessarily on fulfilling what the issues are and satisfying that. So somebody on the right will come in, or needs to come in, and define these issues and lay out a vision for how we can move into the next phase of politics. The left, I think they're very stuck on their globalist ideology. I don't think that there's any changing that. I think that I don't necessarily think that it's the winning ticket, so to speak. I don't think they have the winning set of ideas there, and we can go through those in a different episode. So yeah, I guess that's my take on what happens next. And I'd say, as far as like Cold War, we'll know we're in Cold War II or World War III probably in the next couple years. I think it'll be pretty clear which one it is, and I think we're headed for a pretty massive, I don't want to say depression, but recession, because I think it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's not like a bubble popping. It's not like the housing market crash. It's not like a lot of the things that we've seen in the past. I think it's going to be food shortages this year. I think next year it's going to be, shortages on this and that. And I think it's just going to, cascade, and we're going to feel like we're in a depression, but really it's the numbers are not going to be that bad. But I think everybody's going to feel horrible for a long time. Kind of like the Great Recession was. The stock market started doing fine because they started printing all this money, whatever, and maybe the corporations and the people at the top were. I think we're going to have increased wealth inequality, because that's the default mode of today, unless somebody can capture that argument and make a coherent argument against it, which I don't necessarily see anybody doing that right now either. I don't know. We need leaders on the right, some people that understand what these issues are. I feel strongly that we don't have any strong leaders. I'm wording that very weirdly, but I don't think there's anybody that's looking at it. I think Trump was a strong leader, but is he going to come back, next time and actually campaign on the issues that are the problem? We'll see. That is yet to be determined. And then the left, I mean, goodness gracious, what a disaster. Kamala coming next, whatever. What do you guys think happens next? Let's see.
Saki.
Saki. Jen
Yeah.
Psaki. What's your answer to everything? I don't understand.
Well, I think she's the best president we've ever not had. So, like, I see her more than anybody in the White House. Like, I mean, I know that she's the press secretary, but she seems to be the only person who's able to talk, and barely. But anyways, so final thought here. Whenever you're coming up with a judgment on a trade deal or a law or something like that, a treaty, a lot of times we're only considering, will it work? We're taking a very pragmatic approach, and that's got to be part of the factoring. But I would encourage, whenever anybody looks at things, we should really start with not will it work, but is it just? Is it wise? And then will it work? What are going to be the effects on people? Is it going to create imbalances between people as far as justice is concerned? Is it trading the short term or the long term for the short term? Did we just sell our future? Did we just trade our birthright here if we do this deal? And then the question of, will it achieve what we want it to achieve? Will it even work? And I think a lot of the trade deals that we're looking at have been falling apart in either the first or the second category. Either it's something that's caused injustice in the world, to our own people, or it just wasn't wise. We sold our futures for a slight boost. Globalism really has done some amazing things for the American economy. It really, really has. But at the same time, we don't have the ability to produce anymore. So if something destabilizes, if somebody wants to impose sanctions on us, we're exceptionally vulnerable to them, which is what we're finding out slowly right now, because we're trying to print our way out of that same problem. Like, oh, well, let's just print more money. Great solution. Not going to keep working. Again, that's selling out the future for the present. So that's what I would encourage everybody to consider when you're talking about it with people. Like, don't just ask, will it work? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Does globalism work? The question is also, is it just, and is it wise? And I think most of the globalist policies that we have implemented in the last 30 years, have been probably unwise, some of them unjust, and therefore are slowly breaking down. And that's why we're seeing such a backlash right now. So.
Jeremy, what happens next?
Well, let me say, first of all, it could be catastrophic. I mean, I always like to think, like John Mark put forward, probably another recession, maybe not a depression, things like that. I do think it's not 1970, and I do think it's not 1929. And I think we had a lot of future ahead of us, building productive economies and the Industrial Revolution, things like that. I think the internet revolution has been very interesting, but information's like water. It's going to be very difficult to maintain that dominance out of Silicon Valley. And I wouldn't even imagine it's really not. So, I mean, it could be catastrophic. I mean, the changes that are going on in the world today could be pretty catastrophic for us. I mean, it may be very bad. There is that chance. But I'm like you. I like veer away from that, because if you predict catastrophe too often, you know what I mean. It's just it's one of those things that people stop listening to you. So one of the things I think the future is, I think we're I like Neil Howe's fourth turning, that there's a first, second, third, fourth generation, and that he's been saying since the early 2000s that this is a fourth turning. Sometime before 2025, we would enter a real crisis period. I think we're clearly in the crisis period. I think we've been in a crisis period probably since the end of the Obama era. And so I think the next is sort of like new revolutionary ideas, new revolutionary leaders. I would say that there is some So I'm going to speak not from a Christian perspective, where I normally speak from a Christian perspective. I'm going to speak just purely from an American perspective here. I think there are some reason to be optimistic. First of all, you've seen massive migration away from the cities to small towns. I think the future is local. It is not. It is not on the coast. I don't think it's. I don't think the future is global at all. I think the future is local. I think the next sort of visionary leaders, the thing about Donald Trump that I never liked was not so much his attitude as it was his he was a neophyte politician, and he surrounded himself with people who were either from the Bush White House or from his own family. And I couldn't imagine a worse possible cabinet than, a Bush cabinet mixed with a cabinet with a Trump family. I mean, that just didn't make any sense to me. So Trump's problem was he didn't understand Washington. He understood sort of the problems, but he didn't know how the city worked, and he overestimated his own abilities to make deals and things, and he was never able to take scalps. So I think the next leader will be somebody who can lay out a vision for the country, who can lay out a vision for what we should be and the direction we should be going. And he should be a man who knows how to take scalps too, like he knows how the city works. As much as I'd love to have outsiders in there, outsiders don't understand how Washington works. It is not a business. It is government, and it is a place where monkey wrenches can be thrown into mechanisms very easily. And you don't have to do a lot to stop people. You just have to slow things down. That's really all you had to do. So even with the last election, I knew it was over the election night, not because all the votes had been counted, but because of where the votes hadn't been counted. Pennsylvania and Michigan, full of union guys. They've been throwing monkey wrenches down in that system up there for 50, 60 years. So that's sort of the where I think people fail to understand. And so I think the future for America is going to be radically different. You do have some good leaders coming up. Elon Musk could be president or anything, but you do have people like him floating around the country. You have Mark Cuban is out there, though I'm not a big fan of oligarchs. This will come off like I'm a fan of oligarchs. I'm not a fan of oligarchs. Merely pointing out that there are other very creative people out there who also recognize these problems that we do, except they have the difference between them and us is all we can do is have really a chat about them and a podcast about them. But these guys will throw some money at it, like buy Twitter, for instance, or get involved in Bitcoin, for instance, like Cuban has, and get ahead of the digital currencies and things like that. So I think you do have some. I think DeSantis, if I was looking on the Republican side, I would think DeSantis is probably the future of the party. If he's not, we don't have any sense. I mean, he's the only guy I would imagine could possibly lead forward as other than Donald Trump. And so I think Trump doesn't make it out of the primaries because I think he eventually is going to get hung up on the vaccine business, because all that suppression of information is going to have happened in his White House before it happened in the Biden White House. So, and I also think globalism, because I think globalism is the past, I think the trade-offs with globalism are clearly seen now. It destroyed our towns. It's created opioid addictions. Tech oligarchs have basically poisoned our children's mind through social media. They've divided the country. I think the future is going to be a little bit different than maybe we imagine it, really. I think there's going to come a time in the near future where we really take a hard look at whether or not children ought to be using devices like that and whether they ought to be in schools. I think you're going to see a lot of change in the way we do education, because education is utterly failing. So the next rotation is a first generation of the four turnings, and that is usually radical change, and radical change for the better, generally speaking. It doesn't always turn out for the better. We can have radical change for the worse, but I would expect that there are a lot more really smart, savvy, dedicated people to this nation and to their neighbors, and there's still a lot more hope out there for us than we probably can see, just because the media obscures a lot of it. But podcasts are there, the internet's there, we're all we're all still free to do things, and hopefully that's going to be even more free. So I think the future is going to be away from globalism. It's going to be more local. Migration already shows it. The monetary system is going to change. There's a lot of change coming. We have a problem sometimes where we think the status quo is better than any future that we can imagine. And the status quo is always what we're trying to hold on to. But I would just encourage us to be braver and be ready to face the new seas. And Web3 is out there. The ownership of your information is coming. The ability for you to leverage your own identity and your own life. I mean, the original tools of the internet boxed us in. The new tools of the internet, though, have the ability to do things and to set us free in ways that I think are really, really interesting. And so I just encourage us to look to the future with a lot of bravery and a lot of interest, and to put on a brighter set of goggles. Things are always darker before the dawn. So
yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you both for joining me today. It's been a lot of fun. This has been, I always say every conversation is my favorite conversation because I enjoy these so much. I like, just want to throw in there, I think DeSantis is probably the only one that makes any sense on the Republican side. But I do worry, that just have that positive vision like you were laying out. And I hope he can maybe attach to that, or maybe there is somebody else out there. Certainly hope so. But this has been this globalization episode, the last 3. Next, we're going to talk about tech and immigration, and got a lot of things coming. Probably only 2 more episodes before my summer break. So we will see you next time on the Johnny Random Show.